Great. Hi there. If you're just joining us, we will get started here in just a couple minutes. Thank you for joining us today. We'll get started here in just a minute. All right, it is 1 o'clock, so we will go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm Ann Summers-Hogg, Senior Research Fellow for Healthcare at the Christensen Institute. And today I'll share the highlights from our recent report, Improve or Transform, Choosing the Right Business Model to Deliver Health. And at the end of my presentation today, we'll have a question and answer section so that you can ask any questions that arise during the presentation or that you may have had in reading the report. And if the questions arise throughout the presentation, you can go ahead and put those in the chat function, or you can save them till the end. And when we get to the Q&A, my colleague, Jessica, will be helping moderate that section. So let's dive in. Today, we will be talking about a background on the problem that we're facing and what we pose as the solution in Improve or Transform, which is truly grounded in providing clarity for leaders. We'll go over some details that we share in the report, specifically around the strategy guide and the decision tool that we provide. And then we'll go through some case studies. So sharing some highlights of a few of the innovative organizations that we called out in the report. And then I'll turn it over to you for some questions. So when it comes to the crux of the problem, we have a mismatch between healthcare spending and health. And many of you have likely heard these statistics before. But historically, where we spend our money in the United States is not on what creates health. 90% of our national healthcare spending is allocated to medical care, but that only accounts for 10 to 20% of health outcomes. Drivers of health, also known as social determinants of health, which include economic stability, access and affordability of healthy food, the social connections and social support people have, education access and quality, and the neighborhood and built environment in which people live, account for the remaining 80 to 90% of our health outcomes. And as a result, there is now widespread recognition that reducing health disparities and improving health outcomes depends on addressing these drivers and moving towards a value-based system of healthcare. But how is a leader meant to make that transition? The problem remains that one cannot simply deliver value-based care through a business model that's been built for a fee-for-service environment. And for leaders, unfortunately, the prevailing message has been redesign your business. But that conventional guidance hasn't worked for three reasons. First, it's unclear. Second, it's not personalized. And third, leaders have limited bandwidth to figure out how to redesign their businesses when they're managing today's business under major financial constraints. Now, in our first report, where we tackled this topic of drivers of health, which we released in May, and it was titled "You Are What You Treat," we laid out a business model compass that would help leaders know what types of business models are effectively addressing drivers of health and what can they learn from them so that they can follow a similar path. And what we found is summarized here on the right-hand side of the slide, that if a leader is looking to build a business model that effectively addresses drivers of health and improves health and life outcomes for the people that they serve, it should include the components listed here. So that's a value proposition that enables consumers and customers to achieve their goals, resources that include harnessing a partnership ecosystem that's supported by enabling technology, processes that include a hard-coded approach to creating trust, and a profit formula and priorities that include reimagined revenue streams that are tied to new consumer and customer-focused measures of success. And importantly, leaders who are effectively preparing for value aren't trying to address drivers of health solely by bolting on these changes onto their fee-for-service business model. They're doing something different. And we really wrote Improve or Transform, this latest report, to address the problems that are inherent with conventional advice and to build on that business model compass that I shared on that last slide and that we shared in the first paper. And by providing clear context-specific guidance, we're seeking to support leaders who are on this journey of business model redesign, who are looking to change their businesses in a way that is both successful and sustainable. Now, clarity is easy to say, but not always easy to achieve. And it really starts with understanding that there are two divergent strategic pathways leaders can pursue in order to change their business model. One leads to greater success in the short run. This is the improve pathway. The other leads to longer term, more sustainable success. This is the transform pathway. And each one has a different purpose. Each one has a different set of requirements. Plus, they each come with their own challenges, benefits, and risks. So some of those challenges, benefits, and risks are summarized here at a high level. So let's take a quick look at the trade-offs. When it comes to the time frame for which leaders might see a payoff, with the improve strategy, there's going to be a short-term payoff. They're going to see a quicker return on the changes that they make. Now, when it comes to transforming, this is a longer-term investment, and leaders are going to have to wait a little bit longer to see the payoff here. When it comes to the effort and investment required, when you compare improve or transform, there's going to be less effort and investment with improve. There's going to be more with transform. And when it comes to the risks, this one's really intriguing. And in our interviews, this really came to light. While the risks involved with the improve pathway are lesser in the short term, they tend to be greater in the long term. And it's the exact opposite with transform. There's greater short-term risk, but there's less for the long term. And when it comes to a leader's current business model viability, improve tends to be a better strategy to pursue if their core business is currently doing really well. if their core business is very strong. Whereas the transform pathway becomes the necessary path to take if leaders find themselves in a position where their core business is either already in decline or they're nearing decline. So, knowing these inherent trade-offs associated with the two pathways, how can leaders choose which pathway is right for them? It's challenging because business model change isn't one size fits all. So the right strategy for one leader's organization isn't the right strategy for another's. And in order to determine the right pathway, leaders have to understand their context and then determine the right fit for their organization. And to guide leaders through this process of determining the right business model change and determining their context, we provide a 3-step strategy guide for leaders to follow. Now, this is based on field-tested theory, proven tools from thought leaders in the field, and case studies from both inside and outside of healthcare. So, the 3 steps that leaders should take include, first, articulating beliefs about the future, as well as the organization's mission and vision. Second, mapping the current business model and determining its viability. And third, determining the strategy for change while also accounting for risks. So let's dive into each of these in a little bit of detail. With the first step, articulating mission, vision, and beliefs about the future, not all organizations have articulated beliefs about the future. But in our research, the C-suites of the organizations that pursued either an improve or a transform strategy had aligned around clear beliefs, and these differed significantly from today's status quo. So what they believed to be true about the future was very different from what was true today. And this was especially evident for the organizations who chose to transform. That's to say that their beliefs about what the future would look like when they were choosing the transform pathway were demonstrably different from the present that they were experiencing in today's environment. Now, when pursuing a business model redesign, it's also critical to take a look at the organization's mission and vision. Have they changed? Do they need to? And are the articulated mission and vision still the reason why the organization exists? And does the vision still say where the organization desires to head in the future? If not, if the mission isn't clearly articulating your why, and the vision isn't articulating where the organization desires to go, then it's time to reassess before moving to the next step. After completing this first step, it's critical for leaders to understand their current business model and to determine its future viability. 2 great tools to perform this step are shown here. One, our 4-box business model diagram, which is on the left, which helps leaders to articulate the value proposition that they offer to customers and consumers, the resources and processes they have to have in place in order to deliver that value proposition, and the profit formula that will enable them to deliver that value proposition sustainably. And on the right-hand side here, you see Strategizer's business model canvas. And this takes a more detailed look at 9 different boxes, 9 different components of the business model. Now, you can use these 2 tools individually, you can use them in concert, one way or the other. Whatever tool leaders choose, it's critical to map and understand the current state business model. It's also critical to assess its future viability. And in order to do that, leaders need to look both at current and projected revenues and expenses in order to accurately assess and evaluate whether the model has a viable trajectory going forward. Now, the last step before determining the right strategy for a given organization is assessing the leader's willingness to take on risk in their redesign effort. In our research, we found that those who pursued a transformation pathway acknowledged that even though it required the organization and its leaders to take on more risk in the near term, staying the course with their current business model was actually riskier than investing in a transformation. So once these steps are completed, leaders have the information that they need in order to determine the right strategic pathway and roadmap for their organization. Effectively, at this stage, they've determined what's the destination we want to achieve and what's the risk we're willing to take on the journey to get there. And with that, they can determine the right pathway to follow. And that's where our decision tool comes into play. And that's what you see here on the slide. So armed with the answers from the three-step strategy guide, leaders can use this decision tool in order to determine whether the improve strategy or the transform strategy is the best fit for their current situation. And by answering the three key questions here that are in the gray boxes, leaders can determine, do I improve or do I transform? So first question, is your current business model capable of delivering on your vision? If no, you need to choose your strategy for change. And then the question is, does your profit formula or value proposition need to change to achieve your vision and goals? If yes, you need to transform your model. If no, you can improve your model. We'll talk a little bit in a second here about a case study about an organization that improved their model, that went down the improvement pathway. But it's critical to call out here that in order to improve and not pursue a transformation, you have to fit in new efforts by only altering modular resources and processes. So the right-hand side of our 4-box business model, those capabilities, the resources and processes that help you to deliver on your value proposition. If you have to change your value proposition demonstrably, or if you have to change your profit formula or your priorities, you need to take the transform pathway. The third question is then, do you have multiple years of viability remaining in your current business model? If no, then you should pursue a buy or partner strategy within the transform pathway. And if yes, then you have time to build a new model with different resources, processes, and priorities. Now, in the full report, you can see case studies where we address organizations who have taken each one of these 4 pathways, either the improve path or transform buy, transform partner, or transform build. So now for a little bit more on those case studies. In addition to basing our guidance in the paper on Christensen's business model theory and other strategy and business model thought leaders' work, we arrived at these insights by going through in-depth interviews and case studies of leading innovators in the healthcare field. Now, the paper includes the detail on all 4 of these, but I'm just going to highlight 2 here today. So the first one that I will speak about is Atrium Health. And they took the improve pathway with their social impact work. Again, the full case study is in the report, but some key highlights that I'll share. If you aren't familiar with Atrium Health, they're a large integrated nonprofit health system located in the Southeast across a number of states. And a few years ago, as a result of the CEO, the board, and the C-suite's commitment, combined with a focus on eliminating health disparities that emerged during COVID, social impact and the drivers of health really became a strategic priority for Atrium Health. And Atrium's leaders knew that to carry out this work, they would need additional capabilities, so additional resources and processes in their business model that weren't inherent to their existing fee-for-service approach. However, they were able to take the improve pathway because the value proposition that they offered as part of this social impact strategy wasn't fundamentally different from that of their core business. So what was that value proposition? They were seeking to address the most critical community health needs that were highlighted in the community health needs assessment that they were already performing. As a nonprofit health system, Atrium Health performs the community health needs assessment every few years as required. So this was already a process that was underway. And they also didn't need to change their profit formula in order to deliver on this work. What they did need to change were modular resources and processes. And as I mentioned on the last slide, if that value proposition and the profit formula or priorities have to change, take the improvement pathway. Take the transform pathway. The improvement pathway will only work if modular resources and processes can be altered in order to deliver what you're seeking to deliver. Now, the modular resources and processes that Atrium added were first, a new social impact valuation team. So this team performed a number of new processes that weren't in place in the existing business model. One was grant writing to support social impact work. A second one was measuring the outcomes of the social impact work, measuring how goals were being achieved. And another modular resource that was added and is in the process of being added is including more community health workers on care teams. Now, if you aren't familiar with community health workers, these tend to be non-licensed, uncredentialed individuals who support the providers in the existing care team's work. And importantly, they are from the communities that they serve. That means they are familiar with the lived experience of the patients who they are seeking to support. Another process that was added was ensuring closed loop referrals to outside community-based organizations. So as a part of addressing the drivers of health and better understanding the social needs that patients had, Atrium Health decided that they would also make referrals to additional community-based organizations, and they would track whether the referrals were closed. So community health workers were a key resource to help execute this process. Another process change was expanding the screening of patients for drivers of health and social needs. So this process was already in place, which was important because it wasn't adding a completely new process. It was simply expanding one that was already there. Now, if we look at some of the keys to Atrium Health's success, in summary, I would say 3 things to call out here. First, they didn't alter their value proposition too much. They were simply seeking to do more of what they were already doing, address the most critical health needs that they were already identifying in their community health needs assessment. Second, they kept their profit formula the same. And third, they aligned their social impact goals to existing success measures. So they didn't have to fundamentally change their priorities, which meant that the resources in the system would still be incentivized to deliver on these goals. So that's a high-level overview of the Atrium Health Improve strategy. For more detail, you can get all the nitty-gritty in the report. Now, a second example that I would like to highlight in a very different approach was Advocate Aurora Health. And they decided to take the transform pathway, specifically the buy side of the transform pathway. And this decision was fundamentally grounded in their beliefs about the future, that their core business of healthcare operations would likely face continued declines in profitability. And also that their core business had characteristics that other industries who had been previously disrupted or were currently being disrupted, those characteristics were the same. And as a result of these beliefs, the CEO, the board, and the C-suite committed to both innovating their core business and establishing a new growth strategy for the organization's long-term sustainability. Now, this new growth strategy involved pursuing a focus on consumer health and wellness. And consumer health and wellness offerings weren't a core part of Advocate Aurora's current healthcare operations business model. Because of that, because the value propositions were fundamentally different, a transformation strategy was required. And that's because the value proposition of health and wellness and the profit formula that is required to pursue delivering that value proposition were just too different from the existing fee-for-service model. Therefore, their leaders knew they needed to create an autonomous business unit and establish a fundamentally separate business model that, while connected to Advocate Aurora Health, would function autonomously and as independently as possible. So this new entity was Advocate Aurora Enterprises, is Advocate Aurora Enterprises. It still exists. And they pursued the buy pathway due to the belief that they didn't have time to build. The president of Advocate Aurora Enterprises in our interview called out how critical it was for them to buy. That is, to either invest in or acquire existing organizations in the consumer health and wellness space. And he noted that in order to get to scale, to have this new growth engine really scale and create demonstrable revenue and ultimately margin for the parent organization, that building and incubating innovations just wasn't a viable pathway for their organization if they wanted to get to scale anytime this century. So, because of the beliefs about the future, because of the fundamentally different value proposition and the fundamentally different profit formula required to support delivering on that value proposition, Advocate Aurora Health created Advocate Aurora Enterprises. And they created it as an autonomous business unit, a completely separate business model that would be able to function with autonomy. So, two high-level overviews of organizations that we highlight in the report. So I'll bring it home here with a quick conclusion and then turn it over to you all for questions. First, changing a business model is hard work. And to increase the chances of success for what might seem like an impossible and often is historically ineffective, there are two types of innovative strategies leaders can pursue. And to succeed, leaders must choose their path based on their business model context. Armed with the tools we provide in Improve or Transform, we hope leaders will then be able to make the right choice for their organization. They can choose to improve, or they can choose to transform. With that, I will turn it over to Jess to help moderate the Q&A portion of this presentation.
Thank you, Ann Summers. If you have any questions at all, the Q&A should be open, and you can also put questions in the chat function. I want to give you all a couple minutes in case you're still thinking about any questions that you might have.
And Jess, is it possible for people to speak, or is it best just to put it in the chat?
Either or. I think if someone raises their hand, I can give them permission to actually speak their question out loud. So it's whatever people are comfortable with. I believe you mentioned this at the beginning as well. We are recording the webinar. I mentioned that, we mentioned that in the email we sent out. So if you don't have any questions now, but you do have questions later, we will be sending the webinar back out, and you can email us with any questions as well.
All right, well, we'll give folks maybe a few more seconds, and then we can return some time to you. As folks are thinking, I do want to thank you all again for taking the time to participate in today's webinar and for being a supporter of our work.
Oh, we do have a question. Jay asked, are there any particular challenges that organizations have faced?
Yes, many. This is a great question, Jay. And one thing that we saw in our interviews was, depending on the pathway, the challenges differ. Specifically on the transform pathway, I'll speak about that one. We heard from leaders across organizations. This wasn't specific to one organization, but we heard across organizations that leaders who are performing the transform pathway are constantly feeling as though they are in a defensive mode. So they feel as though it is important to consistently share and communicate with the broader organization the importance of the transformation strategy. So even though it may start as a very small portion of the business, the importance of communication to the broader organization about why this investment is being made and how it will benefit the organization in the long run is especially critical. And another challenge that individuals spoke about was the challenge around resources. Now, as leaders within existing healthcare organizations, you, all the listeners, are likely familiar with resource allocation decisioning and how it can be really challenging to get the resources you need to do typical work, much less work that falls outside of the traditional business model. Now, some keys to overcoming this challenge that we heard from leaders who were successfully going down the transform pathway was that one of the things they did was right from the get-go, they included in their original funding proposal funding for a dedicated team. And that was a similarity across all the organizations. We also heard specifically from the leaders at Advocate Aurora Health that they had created an advisory team that was a subset of the C-suite. I believe maybe the C-suite was 15 or 16 people, and this committee was maybe 8. I might be getting the numbers off a little bit, but this transformation committee was responsible for meeting weekly and ensuring that any sort of strategic conflict or resource allocation conflict that might arise between the new growth engine, Advocate Aurora Enterprises, and the core business, that those decisions were resolved at the highest level of the organization, so that the leaders could be really clear to all of the teams below them what should be done in order to execute against the stated strategy of both innovating the core and transforming for long-term success. Great question, Jay.
We do have another question. Someone asked, in light of these insights, what advice would you give to startups innovating in the healthcare equity space?
That's a great question. So the primary focus, or the primary audience for the second paper that we wrote, was to incumbent organizations. So entities who were seeking to address drivers of health or shift to value-based care, but were operating in a business model that wasn't really optimized for that. Now, for startups who are innovating in the healthcare equity space, they have a huge benefit. They're startups. They're starting from scratch. And they're really empowered to build their business model in a way that will be ultimately impactful. And for that, I would say the first paper that we released in May, You Are What You Treat, will likely include the most helpful advice to you, which is that business model compass that I shared early on in the presentation. And also, it includes a number of case studies, different from the ones in this paper, but a number of case studies of both startups and community-based organizations who are tackling similar issues. And a lot can be learned from the innovative approaches that they took in order to ensure that they're effectively addressing drivers of health to drive improved health and life outcomes. All right. There are no other questions from the group. We will thank you all again for attending today. And as Jessica said a few moments ago, when we send out the recording, if you do have any other questions, our inboxes are always open. Please feel free to reach out with any questions or requests as they arise. Thank you so much, and we hope you have a great afternoon.